savage, cruel, unforgivable. Somewhere out in the burning Texas grasslands, a young woman had just whispered a sentence no daughter should ever have to say. My father. He took my first time. The words fell into the dry wind like a gunshot. She was lying on a broken wagon. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Dust clung to her legs and bare feet, and a tall rancher was leaning over her. For one dangerous second, any man riding past that wagon might have thought something terrible was about to happen again. A 51-year-old man, a helpless young woman, no one else around for miles. The rancher reached down. The girl suddenly woke. Her eyes burst open in pure panic. She tried to crawl backward, but the wagon boards ended behind her. One cracked plank, one rusted iron wheel. No escape. Her voice shook as if it had been breaking for years. My father. He took my first time. The man froze. His hand stopped in the air. Dry wind whispered through the yellow grass. Behind him stood another man, younger, strong, holding the reins of 2 horses. That was Caleb Boone, and the man leaning over the wagon was his father, Elias Boone, a rancher who had lived 51 hard years under the Texas sun. For a moment, Caleb looked at the scene and didn't understand what he had just heard. Then anger rushed into his chest like fire. Pa. What did she just say? But Elias Boone didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he slowly pulled his hand away from the girl. He stepped back half a pace. He removed his hat. The girl stared at him like a trapped animal. Her arms were covered in bruises, some fresh, some older. Her lip was split. Her feet were cut and bleeding from walking across dry prairie ground. Whoever she had been running from had chased her long enough to leave marks, and whoever had hurt her last had hurt her badly. The girl tried to hold herself together for another second, but the strength was gone. Her body sagged. Her head rolled to the side against the wagon plank. She fainted. Caleb rushed forward. Pa. That girl said her own father. He could not even finish the sentence. Elias Boone placed one hand on the edge of the wagon and climbed up slowly. He'd seen violence before. Cattle drives, gunfights, men left dying under desert sun. But the look on that girl's face when she woke up, that was a different kind of damage. Elias poured a little water from his canteen onto a cloth. He wiped dust from her forehead. Her skin was burning with fever. She's been running a long time, he said quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened. Caleb looked at the bruises and didn't want to say the thought out loud, but Elias had already seen it in his eyes. Elias studied the wagon instead of answering. The axle was cracked. One wheel bent inward. The leather harness rope at the front beam had been cut loose in a hurry. Someone had abandoned this wagon fast, or something had happened here that forced them to. One wheel had snapped when the wagon hit a washout in the dark. She had cut the horse loose and tried to run the rest on foot. Caleb kicked the dirt beside the wheel. If a man ever did that to his own daughter. His voice stopped before the rest could come out. Elias finally spoke. We don't know the whole story, but we will. He carefully lifted the girl's shoulder to check for broken bones. As he did, something small slid loose from the inside seam of her dress, a folded piece of paper. Elias picked it up. He turned it over once in his hand. The paper was worn and creased, like it had been hidden there for a long time. Caleb noticed immediately. What is it? Elias didn't open it yet. He slipped it quietly into his vest pocket. A reason, he said. Then he looked out across the prairie, and that was when he saw it, far away along the road that led toward Tascosa. Dust, a rising cloud of it. Riders. More than one. Caleb followed his father's gaze. You think they're looking for her? Elias lifted the unconscious girl carefully into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, just bones and exhaustion. Son, Elias said calmly, anybody who leaves a girl like this out here in Texas summer, he glanced once more toward the distant riders, is not the kind of man who stops looking. Before we go any further, a quick word. This story has been gathered from old frontier accounts and retold with a few shaped details to bring out its meaning, its lessons, and its human weight. The images in this video are created with the help of AI to help you feel that old world a little more clearly. If you stay with me, I think this story will give you something worth carrying. Now, back to that broken wagon in the Texas grass. Elias Boone carried the unconscious girl down from the wagon and toward the horses. Caleb opened a saddle blanket so they could lay her across it gently. The girl's breathing was shallow. Her hands still trembled even while she slept. Caleb looked down at her bruised arms again. Then he looked toward the growing cloud of dust on the road. "Pa," he said quietly, "what if those riders are her family?" Elias placed the girl carefully across the saddle. He tightened the strap. Then he looked once more across the empty prairie. His voice was calm, but something cold had settled behind his eyes. "If the man chasing her is the same one she was afraid of." He paused. Then he finished the sentence slowly. "He won't be taking her back." The horses shifted under the rising heat of the day. The dust cloud on the road grew larger, and somewhere between that broken wagon and the Boone Ranch ahead, one question was beginning to matter more than anything else. What exactly had Clara Whitmore's father done to her? And when the riders finally arrived, how many men would Elias Boone have to stand against to keep her safe? Elias Boone turned his horse toward the ranch without another word. Caleb rode beside him, one hand steadying the girl draped across the saddle blanket. She was still unconscious. The sun had climbed higher now, and the Texas heat pressed down on the open prairie like a heavy hand. Behind them, the broken wagon slowly disappeared in the distance. Ahead of them lay the Boone Ranch, sitting low beside a dry creek bed a mile away. Caleb kept glancing back toward the dust cloud on the road. The riders were still there, still coming. "You think they'll follow us?" Caleb asked. Elias didn't turn his head. "If they're looking for her," he said calmly, "they will." The ride back was quiet. The only sounds were hooves on dry ground and the wind moving through the tall grass. The girl stirred once as the horse shifted beneath her. Her fingers tightened weakly in the saddle blanket. But she didn't wake. By the time the Boone Ranch came into view, the heat had settled into that slow, heavy feeling Texas gets in the middle of summer. The ranch was nothing fancy. A small wooden house, a barn that had been repaired more times than anyone could count, a line of fence posts stretching toward the open prairie, and a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Caleb rode ahead and pushed open the gate. A woman stepped out onto the porch when she saw them coming. That was Mrs. Nora Bennett, a widow who lived nearby and helped around the ranch whenever Elias needed a steady hand. She shaded her eyes and looked closer. Then she saw the girl. "Lord have mercy," she said softly. Elias dismounted carefully. "She's hurt," he said. "Been running for a long time." Mrs. Bennett was already moving. "Bring her inside." Between the three of them, they carried the girl into the small house and laid her on a bed near the window. Mrs. Bennett brought water and a clean cloth. Elias stepped outside again while she worked. Some things were better handled by a woman. Caleb followed him out on to the porch. "You think she'll live?" Caleb asked. Elias leaned against the rail. "She's tougher than she looks." Caleb nodded slowly. Then his jaw tightened again. "What she said back there?" He paused. "About her father." Elias stared out across the ranch land. The wind bent the grass in long, slow waves. "Some men," he said quietly, "should never have been fathers." Caleb kicked the porch step. "If that man comes here looking for her," his voice carried the anger of a young man who had not yet learned patience. Elias glanced at him. "We'll deal with that if it happens." Just then the door behind them creaked open. Mrs. Bennett stepped out. "She's awake." Elias removed his hat again. "Is she frightened? Terrified?" Mrs. Bennett said, "But she's talking." The two men stepped inside. The girl sat up slightly in the bed, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes moved quickly between the two men, still wary, still ready to panic. Elias stayed near the doorway so she would not feel trapped. "You're safe here," he said gently. "No one's going to hurt you." The girl swallowed. Her voice was weak. "Where am I?" "My ranch," Elias answered. "Just outside Tascosa." Her breathing slowed a little, then her eyes suddenly filled with fear again. "He'll come looking for me," Caleb spoke before he could stop himself. Who will? The girl hesitated, like saying the name itself might bring trouble closer. My father. The room grew quiet. Elias pulled a chair closer and sat down slowly. What is your name? She looked down at her hands. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she finally whispered it. Clara. Elias nodded once. Clara, he said calmly. We saw the wagon. Her eyes closed for a moment, as if remembering it hurt. I couldn't go any farther. Mrs. Bennet handed her a cup of water. Clara drank slowly. Her hands trembled. Caleb noticed the bruises again. Dark marks across her wrist. Finger-shaped. His anger came back immediately. What happened to you? Clara didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved toward the window, toward the open land beyond the ranch, like she expected riders to appear there any second. My father owes money, she said finally. He gambled away cattle, money, and then whatever shame he still had left. Her voice carried no drama, just tired truth. He said I had to marry a man named Pike. But that wasn't the worst of it. Elias recognized the name immediately. Harlan Pike, a ranch owner with more cattle than patience. Caleb frowned. You ran away from that? Clara shook her head slowly. No. Then she whispered something that made the room colder. I ran away from my father. No one spoke for a moment. The room understood enough without forcing Clara to say more. Elias reached into his vest pocket. He placed the folded paper on the table beside the bed. We found this when we picked you up. Clara's eyes widened. Her hand moved toward it instantly. Don't let him get that, she said quickly. That paper proves he meant to trade my life for his debt. Elias didn't press her for more. He didn't need to. He had seen enough men in his life to know when a girl was speaking out of terror, not temper, and whatever Silas Whitmore had done, it had followed her all the way to that broken wagon. Elias didn't open it yet, but he understood something important. Whatever was written there had scared her father enough to chase her across the prairie. Outside, the wind shifted again. Caleb walked to the window. Far across the grassland, the dust cloud was still there, closer now. Riders were definitely coming. He turned back toward the room. Pa, he said quietly, they're still on the road. Elias stood slowly. He looked at Clara, then toward the window, then back to the girl sitting in the bed, trying not to shake. And in that moment, he made a decision. Clara Whitmore would not be going back to the man who had broken her. Not while Elias Boone still had breath in his lungs. If stories like this mean something to you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. And while you listen, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you are listening from tonight. Because out on that prairie, danger was already riding closer. The dust cloud reached the Boone Ranch just before noon. Caleb saw the riders first. He was standing near the fence line when the shapes of 3 horses appeared through the heat waves rolling across the prairie. He didn't hurry. He simply walked back toward the house. Inside, Clara was still sitting on the edge of the bed with Mrs. Bennet beside her. Elias stood near the window. Caleb pushed the door open. They're here. Clara froze. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Mrs. Bennet placed a calm hand on her shoulder. Elias stepped out onto the porch. 3 riders came through the gate without asking. The man in the middle rode slightly ahead of the others. He was tall but thinner than Elias, with a gray beard that had not been trimmed in weeks. His coat looked expensive once, but now it hung loose and dusty. His eyes searched the ranch immediately. That was Silas Whitmore, Clara's father. Behind him rode another man in a dark vest with polished boots. His horse was better fed, his hat cleaner. He looked like the kind of man who preferred business deals to hard work. That was Harlan Pike, a ranch owner with money, cattle, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. The third rider stayed quiet behind them, probably hired muscle. Elias Boone stepped off the porch and walked a few steps into the yard. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for a gun, but the way he stood made it clear that this was his land. Silas Whitmore forced a thin smile. Afternoon, he said. Elias nodded once. Silas looked past him toward the house. My daughter wandered off last night. he said. I heard she might have come this way. Elias spoke calmly. A girl did come through here. Silas leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Then I'll take her home. The air on the ranch grew quiet. Caleb moved slowly toward the barn door behind Elias, not threatening, just close enough. Elias shook his head once. She's not leaving. Silas's smile faded. You don't understand, he said. She's my daughter. Elias met his eyes. And she's not going back. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. Harlan Pike cleared his throat. He stepped his horse forward slightly. Let's keep this friendly, he said. His voice was smooth, too smooth. The girl is promised to me, he continued. There is an arrangement between her father and myself. Elias didn't look impressed. She didn't mention agreeing to anything. Pike gave a quiet laugh. Girls her age rarely understand what is best for them. That sentence changed the air. Caleb took another step forward. You mean forcing her to marry you? Pike's eyes slid toward him. I mean helping her family solve a financial problem. Silas suddenly snapped. That girl owes me obedience, same as any daughter under her father's roof. His voice was sharp now. Everything she has came from me. Elias had heard enough. That stops today. The hired rider behind them shifted his horse nervously. He could feel the tension building. Silas leaned down slightly in his saddle. You planning to steal a man's daughter now? Elias shook his head. No. He paused. I'm planning to protect one on his land. A frightened woman still had the right to refuse. And a decent man was supposed to honor that. Silas swung off his horse suddenly. His boots hit the dirt hard. He walked forward 3 steps toward Elias. Up close, the smell of whiskey hung on his breath. That girl belongs in my house, he said. Caleb could see the anger boiling in his father's eyes, but Elias still didn't raise his voice. You hurt that girl. Silas laughed. A father disciplines his child. That was the wrong answer. Caleb moved before anyone expected it. The hired rider stepped forward with a sneer. You Boone boys think you run this county. Caleb's fist answered him. The punch landed hard. The man stumbled backward into the dust. Sit. Silas shouted something and lunged forward. Elias moved fast for a man his age. His hand caught Silas's coat. One sharp motion. Silas crashed into the dirt beside the horse trough. For a second, the entire yard exploded with movement. Boots scraping, horses snorting, dust rising. The hired rider tried to get up again. Caleb pushed him back down. Pike didn't move. He simply watched the chaos like a man studying a card game. Elias released Silas and stepped back. Silas slowly pushed himself to his knees. His face was red with rage. You think this is finished? He growled. Elias looked down at him. No. It just started. Silas stood up slowly. He wiped dirt from his coat. Then he turned toward his horse. Pike tipped his hat once to Elias. This could have been handled peacefully, he said. But some men insist on making things harder. The 3 riders mounted again. Silas paused before leaving. His eyes drifted toward the house. He knew Clara was inside. You can't hide her forever, he said. Then they rode out through the gate. The ranch fell quiet again. Dust slowly settled back to the ground. Caleb exhaled. That went well. Elias didn't smile. He looked toward the house. Inside that small room sat a frightened girl who had just watched her father ride away angry and humiliated. And men like Silas Whitmore didn't forget humiliation. Not in Texas. Not in summer. Caleb brushed dust from his shirt. You think he'll come back? Elias looked toward the empty road. His voice was calm, but heavy. Son, men like him don't come back alone. And somewhere out on that wide Texas prairie, Silas Whitmore was already thinking about the next move. The only question now was this. How far would a desperate father go to take his daughter back? The Boone Ranch felt quiet after the riders left. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes a man listen harder than usual. Caleb leaned against the fence and watched the empty road where Silas Whitmore had disappeared. Dust still floated in the hot air. Well, Caleb said after a moment, that man sure knows how to make friends. Elias didn't answer. He was standing near the barn, looking out across the prairie the same way he had during cattle drives years ago, watching, measuring, waiting. Inside the house, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Bennett. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of water, but she'd barely touched it. Mrs. Bennett spoke gently. "They're gone for now." Clara nodded, but her eyes were still fixed on the window. "You don't know my father," she said quietly. Mrs. Bennett had lived long enough to recognize fear that came from experience, not imagination. "I suspect we are starting to," she answered. Outside, Caleb finally walked toward the barn. He found Elias checking the horses. "You think they come back tonight?" Elias tightened a saddle strap slowly. "No." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "That confident?" Elias shook his head. "No." "That patient." Caleb understood what that meant. Men like Silas Whitmore didn't rush revenge. They waited. They gathered help. They came back when the odds looked better. Caleb kicked a small rock across the dirt. "So what do?" Elias rested his arm on the fence. "We give the girl a chance to breathe, and we figure out what that paper says." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the folded document they had found earlier. The paper looked older in daylight. The edges were worn, like it had been handled many times. Caleb leaned closer. "You gonna open it now?" Elias nodded slowly. He unfolded the paper on the fence rail. Both men read quietly. Caleb frowned first. Then he read it again. "You gotta be kidding me." Elias didn't look surprised. The paper was a signed agreement. Silas Whitmore had promised land that didn't entirely belong to him. And in return, Harlan Pike had promised to erase the debt. But there was another line written at the bottom, a line that made the entire deal uglier. Clara Whitmore was part of the arrangement. Caleb let out a slow breath. So Pike wasn't lying. Elias folded the paper again. "No. But that don't mean the girl agreed to it." Caleb rubbed his jaw. "You planning to show that to the sheriff?" Elias thought about it. Fort Elliott was not far, but law on the frontier moved slower than trouble. "We might," Elias said. "But first, we need to hear the rest of her story." Caleb glanced toward the south. "What about Fort Elliott?" Elias folded the paper and slipped it back into his vest. "We may ride there yet." He looked toward the house. "But law moves slow out here, and men like Silas count on that." Just then the screen door creaked open behind them. Clara stepped outside. She had wrapped herself in one of Mrs. Bennett's shawls. The sun made her squint. Caleb noticed she moved carefully, like every muscle in her body still hurt. Elias walked a few steps closer. "You should be resting." Clara shook her head. "I heard voices." She looked from one man to the other. "They came, didn't they?" Elias nodded once. "They did." Her shoulders sagged slightly. "And they'll come again?" It was not a question, just the truth. Elias handed her the folded paper. "Is this why you ran?" Clara stared at the document. Her face tightened. "My father said it was just business." Her voice sounded hollow. "He said if I married Pike, the debt would disappear." Caleb crossed his arms. "And you said no." Clara gave a small, bitter laugh. "I said no." She looked out across the prairie. "And he said my opinion didn't matter." Silence settled between them. The wind rustled the barn roof softly. Clara turned back toward Elias. "If Pike gets that land," she said quietly, "half the valley goes with it." Elias raised an eyebrow. Meaning my father sold something he had no right to sell." Caleb shook his head slowly. "That explains Pike." Clara looked tired again. But something else had appeared in her expression. Determination. "My mother used to say the Boone Ranch was the only place around here where a person could still trust a handshake." She looked directly at Elias now. Was she wrong? Elias Boone had lived long enough to know the weight behind a question like that. He answered simply, "No." Clara nodded once. That single word seemed to give her a little strength back. Caleb suddenly glanced toward the horizon. The road was empty, but something else had caught his attention. A distant echo, like hooves. Far away. Maybe, or maybe not. He frowned. "You hear that?" Elias listened. The prairie wind moved slowly through the grass again. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then faintly, very faintly, hoofbeats, not 3 horses. More. Elias's eyes narrowed. Caleb looked toward him. "Pa." Elias's voice was quiet, but steady. "Looks like Silas Whitmore found himself some friends. And if those riders were coming back to the Boone Ranch tonight, they were not coming to talk." The sound of hoofbeats grew clearer as the sun slowly dropped lower over the Texas grasslands. Caleb Boone stood near the fence line, one hand resting on the rail. He was listening carefully. At first the sound came and went with the wind, then it returned again. More than one horse, more than a few. Caleb looked toward his father. "You hear that now?" Elias Boone nodded slowly. "I do." But he didn't rush. Men who had lived long on the frontier learned something important. Panicking early solved nothing. Inside the house, Clara Whitmore sat at the table while Mrs. Bennett poured hot tea. She held the cup with both hands. The warmth steadied her a little. She had not eaten much yet, but she was trying. Mrs. Bennett watched her quietly. "You've been strong for a long time," she said gently. Clara stared into the tea. "I didn't feel strong. You survived," Mrs. Bennett replied. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Outside, Caleb finally stepped onto the porch. "Elias," his father came around the side of the barn. "They're coming," Caleb said. More than before. Elias walked past him and looked toward the horizon. Now the dust was visible again, wider than earlier. Silas Whitmore had not come back alone. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Looks like he brought half the county." Elias watched the distant riders calmly. "Not half. Just enough to feel brave." Caleb gave a short laugh. "That's comforting," but his voice carried tension. Inside the house, Clara had also heard the horses now. She stood slowly. Mrs. Bennett tried to guide her back to the chair. "You need rest." Clara shook her head. "No." Her voice was quiet. "But I need to see." She walked carefully to the doorway and stepped onto the porch. From there she could see the same rising dust Elias and Caleb were watching. Her face went pale. "He found them." Caleb glanced sideways. "Found who?" Clara swallowed. "Men who drink with him in Tascosa. Men who owed him favors. Men who didn't ask many questions." Elias finally turned away from the road. He looked at Clara. "You said Pike wanted your land." She nodded. "And your father promised it." Another nod. "But he can't give it to Pike unless you marry him." Clara understood immediately. Her shoulders lowered slightly. "You figured it out." Caleb crossed his arms. "So this whole thing is about land?" Clara shook her head. "No." Her voice carried a deeper sadness. "It started with land." She looked down at the porch floor. "But with my father," she hesitated, "it became something else." Elias didn't push her. Some truths came out slowly, and forcing them too soon could break a person all over again. Instead, he said something simple. "You won't be going back with them." Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were searching his face carefully, like she was trying to decide whether that promise was real. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you." Caleb stepped closer to the porch railing and studied the approaching riders again. "There are at least 6 of them." Elias spoke calmly. 7. Caleb counted again. "You're right. 7. Caleb exhaled slowly. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Elias glanced toward the barn. "We moved the horses behind the ridge." Caleb nodded immediately. "And rifles. In the house." Claire stiffened. "I don't want anyone hurt because of me." Elias looked at her. His voice stayed calm and steady. "Clara, this stopped being just about you the moment those men rode onto my land." Mrs. Bennett stood in the doorway behind them. "And if they think they're walking into this house like they own it," she said firmly, "they're in for a surprise." Caleb smiled slightly. He had always liked Mrs. Bennett. He hurried toward the barn to move the horses. Elias stayed on the porch with Clara. The riders were closer now. Silas Whitmore rode in front again. Harlan Pike was beside him. Pike looked relaxed. Like a man arriving at a business meeting he expected to win. Clara's hands trembled slightly. Elias noticed. "You don't have to stand here," he said. She shook her head. "I do." The riders slowed as they reached the Boone gate. 7 men. 7 horses. 7 sets of eyes scanning the ranch. Silas called out first, "You ready to send my daughter home now?" Elias stepped down from the porch. Calm, steady. "No." Pike leaned forward in his saddle. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Elias looked directly at him. "Seems to me you made it hard the moment you tried to buy a girl." The hired men behind them shifted uneasily. They had come expecting intimidation, not resistance. Silas's face turned red. "You think you can keep her from me?" Elias answered without raising his voice. "I know I can." The wind pushed across the yard again. Dust lifted around the horses' hooves. For a moment nobody moved. Then Pike slowly smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "You misunderstand something, Mr. Boone." His voice stayed smooth. "We didn't ride all this way just to argue." Caleb stepped out from the barn behind Elias. A rifle rested casually in his hands. Mrs. Bennett stood inside the doorway with another. 7 riders. 3 defenders. The math looked simple, but men who underestimated Elias Boone often learned the hard way. Silas leaned forward in his saddle again. "Last chance," he said. "Send her out." Elias didn't move. And that was when one of the hired riders slowly reached toward the rifle hanging from his saddle. The prairie seemed to hold its breath, because the next few seconds were about to decide whether the Boone Ranch would remain quiet Texas land or turn into a battlefield. The man reaching for the rifle never finished the movement. Caleb Boone had been watching him the entire time. The moment that hand touched the wood of the gun, Caleb lifted his own rifle just enough for everyone to see it clearly. No rush, no shouting, just a quiet signal that things were about to go very wrong if anyone made a foolish choice. The prairie wind moved slowly across the yard. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. 7 riders, 3 people on the ranch, but numbers do not always decide a fight. Sometimes it is something else, something harder to measure, something like conviction. Harlan Pike looked at Caleb's rifle, then at Elias Boone standing calmly in the dirt. He could see something in Elias's eyes that men like Pike usually recognized very quickly. This was not a bluff. Elias Boone was the kind of man who had already made his decision. Silas Whitmore noticed it too, but anger's a powerful thing. It makes a man believe foolish odds. "Move aside," Silas snapped. "You can't stop this." Elias spoke quietly. "I already have." Silas's face twisted with frustration. He glanced at the riders behind him. Most of them had stopped smiling. 2 of them had already gone pale enough to tell the truth. They had expected an easy intimidation. Instead, they found themselves staring at a rancher who looked completely prepared to die before stepping aside. And suddenly the job didn't feel worth the trouble anymore. One of the hired riders shifted in his saddle and looked toward Caleb's rifle. Another glanced at the house and saw Mrs. Bennett standing steady in the doorway, not frightened, not wavering. A third man looked back toward the open prairie behind them, already measuring how fast he could get clear if bullets started flying. These were not loyal men. They were borrowed men. And borrowed men rarely died for another man's family shame. Harlan Pike noticed it at once. He had money, but money could not force courage into a weak spine. He leaned toward Silas and spoke low. "Look at them. They didn't come here to die for you." Silas glared at him. "You said it would be easy." Pike kept his eyes on the men behind them. "I said it would be profitable." That ended the moment Boone's boy drew a line. Silas looked toward the porch again, toward the doorway where Clara Whitmore stood beside Mrs. Bennett, his daughter, the girl he had chased across miles of prairie. The girl who now refused to look at him. That hurt more than the bruised pride. For a moment, something strange passed across his face. Not regret, but something close to it. Then the moment disappeared. Silas swung his horse around suddenly. "This ain't finished," he shouted. His voice sounded smaller than before. He kicked his horse forward and rode out through the gate. Harlan Pike watched Elias Boone one last time. Then he tipped his hat slightly. "A stubborn man," he said, "but perhaps a decent one." Then he turned his horse and followed Silas. The other riders didn't hesitate. One by one, they left the Boone ranch behind as the dust slowly settled again. The prairie became quiet once more. Caleb lowered his rifle. "Well," he said, "that could have gone worse." Elias watched the road until the last rider disappeared into the distance. Men like Silas Whitmore were dangerous, but sometimes the most powerful weapon on the frontier was simply standing your ground. Claire stepped down from the porch slowly. Her legs still trembled, but she walked toward Elias anyway. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she didn't look afraid, just tired and relieved. "I thought he would never leave," she said softly. Elias nodded once. "Men like him usually come back." Clara looked at him. "But not today." "No," Elias said. "Not today." Caleb leaned against the fence again. He watched Clara carefully, and something in his expression softened. For a young man, it is easy to mistake protection for love, but sometimes protection's simply the right thing to do. Days passed after that. The prairie returned to its quiet rhythm. Word traveled fast through Tascosa. Silas Whitmore had ridden onto another man's land and failed. Harlan Pike had shown his hand too early. And before the week was out, word of Pike's arrangement had reached Fort Elliott as well. Men like Silas and Pike were suddenly finding fewer doors open to them. And men who had once been willing to ride with them suddenly found better things to do. Horses needed feeding, fences needed repairing. And the Texas wind never stopped moving across the grass. Clara stayed at the Boone Ranch. At first she helped Mrs. Bennett in the kitchen. Later, she helped Elias with small ranch work, keeping records, checking supplies, learning the slow, honest rhythm of a place where nobody raised a hand in anger. For someone who had lived with fear for so long, that kind of quiet felt strange at first, but healing often begins in small, quiet moments. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stay somewhere safe long enough to remember who they are. There is something in that which I think about often. Stories like this one are not really about gunfights or ranch land. They are about choices. Every person in this story faced one. Silas Whitmore chose anger. Harlan Pike chose profit. But Elias Boone chose something different. He chose to stand between cruelty and someone who could not fight alone. And that choice changed everything. I will tell you something honestly. When I first came across this story, I kept asking myself a simple question. What would most people have done in that moment? When trouble rides toward your door, when it brings more men than you have, when the easy path is simply stepping aside, would you still stand there? Would you still say no? Or would fear make the decision for you? Because courage is rarely loud. Most of the time it looks exactly like Elias Boone standing in a dusty yard saying a quiet word. No, there's another lesson here too. Sometimes the strongest people you will ever meet are the ones who survived something terrible. Clara Whitmore crossed miles of prairie alone, barefoot, bruised, exhausted, but she kept going. And that is something many of us forget. Survival itself is strength. If you're listening to this tonight and you have ever walked through a hard season in your life, remember that. The fact that you kept going already says something about the kind of person you are. Maybe the real reason stories like this still matter is because they remind us of a simple truth. One good decision can change the direction of someone else's life. One moment of courage can stop cruelty in its tracks. And one person willing to stand their ground can become the reason another human being finds hope again. If this story meant something to you, take a moment and let me know. Leave a like on the video so more people can discover stories like this. And if you enjoy these kinds of old frontier stories, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more waiting to be told. But before you go, I want to leave you with one last thought. Tonight, somewhere out there, someone may be facing a moment just like Elias Boone did. A moment where the easy choice and the right choice are not the same thing. And the question waiting in front of them will be very simple. Will they stand or will they step aside?